Mr. David Cooperstein. How are you, man?
I'm good. How are you doing, Jake?
Good. I always like the cliche intro, even though we just talked for 5 minutes.
They don't know that.
Nobody has to know it. Nobody has to know it. But thank you for joining me. It's interesting getting people used to a really casual vlog podcast, if you will, like we were just talking about, because I think it's one of the things that I'm trying to do with this. And, hence the conversation right now is like dispel some of the formality and the posturing that
Yeah.
goes with a lot of this and just talk frankly, because I think that's when
Well,
great
you haven't
conversation.
given me a set of questions, so you're going to get the raw answers.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, and it's not meant to be scripted either, right? But I mean, the main focus is, as I'm trying to build this company and build every day, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from a kind of mentor figure of mine who she taught me that I should, divide what I need in my business and my life into kind of a trivial pursuit pie piece. And everything that I'm bad at should be a different slice of the pie. And even things I'm good at, right? To recognize that you're not going to be the best and find people that represent that. And I took it very literally and literally, divided my life up into things I'm terrible at and found some people initially. This was a while ago.
Only 6 pieces.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was 2 pieces. Only 2 things I'm bad at. It was a big pie and a lot of pieces. But what I realized doing that was, I think, very humble pie, right? A piece of humble pie was that there were so many more pieces, and I would talk to so many people with great input. You and I got connected through the Hatchet Network.
That's right.
Shout out to Dalton and Hatchet Ventures and everything they're doing. And I immediately gravitated towards you, whether you like it or not, mainly because we go to the same barber. But
amazing.
Yeah, but also just because of your experience. And, for the sake of it, I want to spend some of this time learning more about your path, because we got to talk about it a little bit, but I want to know like how you got to even to Chapel Hill, right? And where you are physically, but like talk about your path to where you are now.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. All right. So shoot, where'd you start? Where were you born?
Where do you want me to start? I've been around a long time.
Well, I mean, start with the early path, because I think one of the things I'm tackling right now, and I think it's prevalent, is the traditional path to entrepreneurship, especially in technology, right? And I'd love to know more, like, how did you get started in your world?
Well, to reflect on that, it's such a long time ago, but I started in corporate America. I worked in a management consulting firm, one of the big 3 consulting firms at the time, strategy consulting firm. So I was at Booz Allen, which was a competitor to BCG and McKinsey back in the day. Now it's a little bit more off the radar. But I was, and that was an accident in itself, winding up there, because I was not recruited the traditional way. I was recruited to a small division that I interviewed on a Saturday, and they hired me before I left the office. It was just a very strange experience. So maybe I was always a little bit of an odd duck that way. But they sat me down and had me do things I had never done before, and I figured them out on day one. And I remember just being completely nervous about what I was doing, but knowing that I sort of had the resource to figure it out up here.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be a great experience for the way my brain works, because I was working on something different every week, and meeting people and learning how different businesses work. And that led into a corporate job at Northwest Airlines when they still existed. That will date for everybody on the podcast who has never heard of Northwest Airlines. And then from there, I sort of wove in and out of a lot of different experiences. I worked for a small consulting firm. I worked for a very small consulting firm, sort of this sort of innovative research lab back when the internet was, as I like to call it, the black and white days of the internet. Before the browser was even a thing. So again, dating myself, but it was important to think about it that way. And then I wound up, so leading up to my technology experience, that was all business experience that I got by doing things, but never in the traditional way. I never went through a recruiter to get a job. I never went through even on campus recruiting. and everything I did was kind of doing it for the first time and figuring out how to do it. I was not a big one to ask questions. I was one to like sit down and just, doggedly figure out how to get stuff done, and it always worked out. And the reason why I went to these smaller companies was partly because I thought I was going to go back to business school, which I never did. And I think that was probably the best decision I made from a debt perspective in my life. And I kept learning new things. So by the time I was, let's call it 30, I had worked in airlines. I had worked in railroad. Had to do the consulting experience, railroads. I had worked with some government agencies. I worked with commercial agencies. I worked with auto manufacturers. That was the consulting experience. I went deep on airlines and learned a lot about that industry. So that was kind of cool. And then I guess right when I was applying to business school, I wound up working for this little research lab. It was 8 people in a room. They had been an offshoot of a bigger consulting firm that was looking into the things that we now call internet, but it was communications, consumer electronics, content, and I always forget the fourth C, but it was called the C4 Lab.
Cool.
So we were looking at all the things that now sort of amass themselves into the internet experience. And the thing that I always took away from that was we thought this was the coolest thing in the world because this is how we were doing our research to figure out what was going on in the world. They did a project looking at how, I think it was India, the rural and urban penetration of telecom into India by like all the little states and all the little towns. But I found all the answers because I went on the internet before we had the browser. I was actually like using Usenet and all that to figure out where this stuff was. So that was how I got exposed to the internet pre-World Wide Web. And then the web came out and we were like, oh my God, we are sitting on a gold mine here. And we went to a client that was, and this was early in the internet experience. And we went to a direct marketing company that sold kind of like Columbia House, if you remember. They used to sell these CDs on a negative option basis.
Yeah.
And we were trying to explain this internet thing to the CEO who was selling this very archaic way of selling CDs. And he's like, I don't get it. So I took him out of the room and I sat him down at his desk with a mouse, and he had the browser on his computer already. I confirm that. And I was like literally clicking on things for him, just clicking on blue links. And he, like 10 minutes into that, he's like, get out of my office. And I'm like, sorry, I didn't know how I offended you. He spent an hour and a half surfing the web. And he was just so blown away, and it started making him think about how this all translated into his business. And I was doing this with people from Prodigy and people from AOL before AOL had a browser, and CompuServe. It was all sort of veterans from those businesses. And so we were like basically treading new ground. And I fell in love with technology. I sort of liked the telecom side of it at the time. There's just so much cool stuff going on in telecom at the time because that was the thing that was stringing everybody together. So then I went to Forrester Research, sort of left the entrepreneurial small consulting firm, but I got to go back out and learn again. And for 5 years, I did research on everything related to telecom. And then when e-commerce became big, I became the director of the retail practice there. And just kept doing the same thing, which was I didn't know anything about telecom when I became a telecom analyst.
Yeah.
I just sort of fled my way into it. Don't tell my old boss that. And the same thing with retail. I knew enough about retail to be dangerous, but I just started to realize that I could depend on my willingness to learn as a way to do new things. And from there on, it never really stopped me. When did I become an entrepreneur? So my first startup was after that first. I was at Forrester twice. So after the first stint, I went to work with a friend of mine, where he and I worked on the business plan for a while. And then he's like, do you want to join the company? I'm like, sure, all right, why not? So I was employee number 3, as I like to say, because I had to hire a CFO to do my paperwork. And then we built a company that was sort of an amalgamation of MySpace and Friendster and NPR and blogging, all of which didn't really exist at the time we were doing this. This was 2004 or 5. And so we created this great thing that, and if he's listening, he'll appreciate this comment now, maybe. But it was so complicated that really only he could understand it, but he couldn't dumb it down for the average audience. But the idea was to create like a Friendster MySpace for older people.
Nice.
So they could talk, they could talk in the language that they needed to understand. And so it's basically like a social blogging platform, kind of like Medium, I guess.
Yeah.
Early days. Was a great experience, but then, I got it wasn't going where I thought it should go. And as any entrepreneur learns, when you are hired as sort of a VP level person, you have 5 jobs. And when those 5 jobs become 1 job, you get bored because you're used to doing 5 jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then somebody said, you should really talk to this guy. And this is how I have changed jobs always, like, just go talk to this guy. And I wound up becoming, for the first time, and by this time I had never done a traditional marketing job. And he hired me as a CMO. And it was just one of those things where he didn't really know what he needed, but he knew that I could probably figure out what he needed, and I got along with everybody. So he's like, yep, you're the CMO. Thankfully, there was a guy there who actually knew how to do marketing, doing on the fly. So I was really hired more as a strategic CMO than a day-to-day CMO. And this guy was definitely benefited from my being hired because he was still a manager after 10 years, and he became the CMO when I left.
Oh, nice.
He had all the skills, but he just needed the competence and executive presence. So for me, that was entrepreneurial for me, even though the company was 15 years old. From there, so that was my first CMO gig. I have had a couple since then. But I went back. So I'm not going to go through all the detail, but I went back to Forrester for a few years. When I left Forrester, I went to a full-time job, and one of my clients at Forrester said, I really didn't think you would ever take a full-time job again. I thought you would go off on your own. And she said that to me before we went on stage in front of 3,500 people. And so the whole time that I'm sitting there, this was my last speaking gig ever at Forrester, was in London at an Adobe Summit. And I'm sitting there next to the CMO of Adobe, awesome woman, and the head of IT for the Vatican, who was probably the funniest person I've ever met.
The head of IT for the Vatican sounds like the beginning of a joke.
Well, he would tell you the end of that joke. He was so funny. The third person I think was from Aston Martin, other than me. But we were on these jumbotrons. We had been all made up, and just before we go on stage, she's like, "Why?" I told her I was quitting, and she's like, "Why are you taking another job? You should go out on your own." And I'm like, "Well, I already signed that paperwork, so that's not happening." A year later, I realized that she was right, and so I went on my own and just started basically doing what I do now, which is for the last 8 years, I've been doing freelance CMO gigs for for entrepreneurs who know they need marketing but don't really know how to do it.
Yeah, that's so smart. And it's funny, I got to connect you as another kind of third tertiary connection through Hatchet. I don't know if you met Marcus, but I'm forgetting Marcus's last name, but he's great. We connected through, I think, Akio and one of his friends, but he's kind of a fractional CEO. Okay. Right. And he'll go in and he's doing it right now for a friend's company, and he's done it a few times, and he's so smart and he gets the whole picture. And it's kind of a similar story where not with the same experience, but he goes into it and he just has that great knowledge. And I think he really can transition a team and really build it out and get them all working together towards the same goal. I don't know his day to day, but he just seems like that person. Super sharp, knows his business. And I think he also has that sense of curiosity, which is one of the big ones. And we're tackling that in a number of ways, which is, as we look to grow, as we look to build, how do we keep that sense of curiosity? So when roles shrink from 5 to 1, we have the same momentum. Really quick backtrack though. Shout out to Forrester. The pie creator that I was talking about, the baker, is an ex-Forrester. It's Kate Delhagen.
Oh yeah, well, Kate. Yeah, that's the other connection we have is Kate.
Yeah, and so she's great. I have another advisor on my team who I connected with through Kate as well, who Nancy Montserrat, who's just one of the all-time greats of the advertising world. And regardless, one of the things that we were talking about, back to the curiosity role, I'm actually talking with a very good friend of mine right now who's, I think, the smartest guy I've ever met. And he's going to retire from the Navy in June, right? And so he's looking to transition out of this. And he's been kind of forward operating, kind of special operations kind of guy. And he's like, how do I, like, what's the next step? What do I do after this job that took him, learning multiple languages, being all around the world, being in high intensity kind of situations? And I'm like, dude, you should join a startup. This is this is this is
Okay,
this is the,
cakewalk in comparison.
yeah, it'll be a cakewalk in comparison. But if you have, I think where startups and transitional things like you're talking about, I mean, I came from agency world where I built my agency. It was very similar. I got to learn a new business with every new client.
Yep.
And that was my favorite part, David. I got to go in and see a massage therapy business, to a, global footwear brand, to a hospitality company, to digital products. And I got to just deep dive every time we got the RFP, let alone the
Well,
business.
you can see, like, people who have come out of the agency world, they're very quick on their feet because they've always had to be. And
Yeah.
they're not really daunted. I worked for an agency, but only while I was in college. It was the only time I worked for an agency. But you can just tell that there's sort of I don't know if it's what you bring in or what you get out of it, but everybody who has worked at an agency is just so great at thinking on their feet.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, is like we could facetiously call it shared trauma, right? If you if you
Well,
if
there's
you've
that
ever
too.
yeah, if you've ever been in an agency and had the typical, I mean, you were in consulting, and it's
The same idea.
yeah, you have that principal agent relationship that can be so frustrating, but also very rewarding.
Yeah.
And as we look at like really growing, and I think it's the power dynamic that you see in early stage, growth stage, and late stage companies is when you start off nimble and everybody just feels like they have a common purpose and they get to touch everything. And then in growth stage, you start to do that with a little bit of money and more manpower. So it's kind of exciting and like, ooh, we're real serious people now. And then you get to the kind of expansion or later stage, and it slows down, and it's about incremental building, and 5 jobs turns to one, etc. And I think that's where, interestingly, startups actually find their path.
Right. When they're no longer startups.
Yeah, when they're no longer startups, right? And it's even why startups exist, if we want to look at it existentially, because somebody said it. I'm forgetting who, but it was this quote about how startups should not exist. Like, they should not succeed. I mean, they should not succeed because the incumbents, look at us and what we're doing. Well, Microsoft and Google and Apple and so on and so forth have more money, more talent, more exposure, more current customers, but they're paralyzed by it.
Well, it's that last part. Like, they have current customers, so they can't just change things on a dime. When you're a startup, you don't really have customers yet, so you can change things to what the market needs. And that period between mid stage and growth stage, or mid stage and late stage, is that you start having customers that are dependent on what you said you would sell to them.
Yeah.
And so that's when the creativity goes out the window, because you can't change things too quickly, because customers don't like change.
Yeah. No, I mean, they absolutely don't. I mean, I don't. If my company were to just like suddenly change on a dime and offer me a different service, I'd be pissed.
Well, it's interesting. Like, we've talked about all the different platforms and how they do things. Google actually does a great job at changing the product without telling anybody, but it's always an enhancement. And not that they're the best in the world, but there are some things that I wish they would work on. But the things that they work on, like, you look at slides or docs or any of those things that are productivity apps, they keep getting better, and even in ways that you don't realize, or they get better in a corporate setting, even if they're not getting better in a consumer setting. It's really interesting to see how easily the way they set up that business allows that to happen versus Microsoft Word, which is, sorry if this is a partner.
No,
There's
I
such
hate
a
Microsoft
from the software standpoint, and understandably, their online version is probably better than the hardware, the downloaded version, but they just can't innovate that quickly because there are companies that depend on 14 versions ago.
Yeah.
And they just there's just a lack of innovation that's even possible for that kind of product.
Yeah, I have a joke just to harp on Microsoft, that what's the first words that a team says when they adopt Microsoft?
What is it?
How do I get off? Listen, man, we laugh because it's true.
Yeah,
And
or it's
and
just, it's a frustrating product.
it is a frustrating product. And I think that, it's funny is like, as we go down this road, and I have a brilliant head of product, right? He's so good. And my job as the CEO, aside from leadership, what's the best? Claire Hughes Johnson put leadership in the best possible way. She was the COO at Stripe,
Mhm.
and she's an ex Googler, and she said management is getting to your deadline quicker, faster, better. Leadership is disappointing people better. It's like learning how to disappoint people better. I'm like,
Yeah.
I love that. But anyways, to the point before I digressed was on a product standpoint, I'm carrying over some of the lessons I learned from the agency days.
Mhm.
And we started really doing brand and kind of management and product development, right? That was really where we found our sweet spot, but it got to the core of businesses. So it related a lot to management consulting. But what I've carried over was this fundamental, very oversimplified philosophy that I developed, which was never sell a linear solution, sell a framework.
Mhm.
Right. And you want to, I have a very, basic visual, which is if you imagine like a straight line, everything's going to deviate from it because you
Right.
can never control for that. But if you build kind of a pipe, if you will, in a 2D world, you give things a flexibility, and all you do is here's the top threshold, here's the bottom threshold. Don't go beyond that. And in that type of system, especially within a product system, and this is what I think Google has done well, right? What you allow for is incremental product improvements versus just deviations.
Yeah.
And when you sell that linear solution, oh, this is what we do, and then you have a bunch of linear solutions on top of it, you end up with this really distorted view of innovation, which is just features.
Mhm.
Right. And they deviate from what that core product is. I think what Google did really well from the get-go, and to their credit, they still do in a lot of ways, is they built a really simple, very broad platform and said, hey, we're not going to do all these features. We're going to have this limited set. Their spreadsheets. I remember it was so limited when it first came out, and every Excel keyboard junkie in the world said, oh, this is terrible. Why would you ever use
Right.
sheets? And you're like, well, because 90% of the world doesn't need the golden keyboard functionality.
Right.
Right. And that's very much something we brought into every day, which is we call it the 90-10 rule, is do 10% of the features that people use for 90% of their work.
Yeah.
And then let them fill in the rest. Right. And in that way, we allow for a lot more flexibility to, I think, how real people work, and I that's what we're trying to carry forward. But I'm interested. So you've gone down this route. You've been in consulting, you've been in corporate America, you've worked on everything in the monopoly board, railroads, airlines, et cetera, utilities probably. And let's hope not the jails. And then you've done the startup culture, you've worked at Forrester, and now you're working in this like CMO kind of, how would you call your role right now? Like what how would you
Well, it
describe
depends on the month because the role changes. But when I decided to leave full-time work and do things on my own, there were three things that I packaged myself because any good marketer knows packaging matters.
Yeah.
So there were three things I could do. I could do strategic projects like positioning. I could do research projects because I had been at Forrester, and people sometimes need to do either customer research or external research. Or I could be a part-time CMO. A lot of people come for actual CMOs. I like part-time better because I think you get all of my brain just for part of the time. And so I just packaged myself up that way, and then people would choose their own adventure from there. Nobody ever bought the package, but they bought some variation of it. But it's been great because it keeps me busy. It keeps me interested in new businesses. I've seen some new categories grow because it gets me in front of the new thing that people are doing. It's generally been with startups, usually seed or A-stage startups. And so it allows me to be creative and allows me to be thinking about the big picture stuff and it's before you get into the weeds, which is what I've liked. So I've done that for 8 years now. So it depends on what I'm doing at the time, whether I have a name that I would call myself. Like right now I'm doing a fractional role, as they call it. I call it an interim role because it's full time but not forever. Um, and in that case, actually the team keeps calling me CMO, even though I'm technically a VP of marketing. Um, but, this is I think the fifth time I've taken on a titled role in a company
Cool.
since I went freelance. But there are times where I'll just be working on research projects, and the other side of my brain will turn on. Like I just finished before this started, I did some research reports that'll get published in the next couple of weeks. And I get to talk to people who were my peer group. So I'm talking to CMOs about what they're doing on a particular topic. And I don't have to pretend that I know what their day is like because I actually know what their day is like. And
That's
so
great.
the group that hires me to do that, they love the fact that I am part of that peer group. I'm not a researcher, learning on the fly. I'm just learning, like I'm able to talk to them as a peer. So we get great insights out of that. And so then I'm a researcher, then I'm just me doing research for somebody. And sometimes I enjoy that more. And then, then I have the breaks in between, which are also awesome.
It's also such an indispensable thing to have somebody that actually knows the day-to-day role. Like, myself included, I founded my first company. I had no idea what I was doing. I had zero idea. Like, it's like I kind of pieced it together over time, hence the value of experience. But having people that you can go talk to that you're like, hey, David, what in the hell should I even expect from this? Like, and that's actually leads to a very active question. I'm curious, and I hope it doesn't overstep because I was going to ask you this from the beginning.
Yeah,
and then you just did a project, it sounds like, on this. But I'm really curious, like, as somebody who has seen the internet in its black and white days, as you said, and has transitioned over time and also seen it from a third party outside into actually operating, like, what are the big question right now is, how do you think that this market, especially marketing, is going to shift in the next 2 to 5 to 6 years? But I'm also curious, like, what are the big shifts that you've seen in startup marketing over the last, however many years, and what do you think it's going to be like in the future?
Yeah. So I'll take the first question. I'll take the second question first.
Okay.
Startup marketing. So startups have changed a lot, as you can imagine, and I think it was really difficult. My first startup was back in 2004, and the way we got the word out was through, I kid you not, radio.
Yeah.
We had to pick a name, and part of that was because of where our funding came from. Because part of our funding came from American Public Media, which is an NPR radio show producer.
Cool. Yeah.
But it actually was a great learning experience. But marketing, so you had to pick a name that was understandable. The name of the company was Gather.
Okay.
Everybody could spell it. You didn't have to, figure out whether people could spell it or not. And you need to get the entire value proposition into a 30-second clip or less, right? They had a certain maximum that you could spend time letting them talk about what you do. So to do that for an internet property is kind of a challenge because you need to be really crisp about what the value proposition is. But the opportunity to spend money with Google in 2004 didn't exist. Right? Yahoo and Google, Yahoo being the first actually, and then Google just making a better business out of it, didn't exist. You didn't have search advertising.
Yeah.
You had some banner ads on publisher sites, but that still wasn't really figured out yet. So when you're thinking about a consumer startup, the change has been that it has become so easy to make the instruments work for you. That did not exist in the 2000s. I mean, never mind how hard it was to build a startup anyway, because you didn't have AWS.
Yeah.
You didn't have cloud-based, productivity suites that you could use for free. Everything cost money back then, which is why companies used to go public sooner because they actually needed the money, as opposed to now where they're just paying back investors. But the marketing effort was much more traditional marketing applied to a digital property. If that's the way to think about it. And now in the whole direct-to-consumer world of e-commerce and all that, it's all a self-contained environment of, until you're ready to go brick and mortar in the consumer world, everything is self-contained and you can see attribution very clearly. You can test things on a daily basis or a weekly basis. I mean, if you're a data geek, you can have so much fun doing marketing now because it's so much less visual and so much more about the data.
Yeah.
And the instrumentation. Like, we talked about Google's productivity suite. I wouldn't say I love Google Ads and Google Analytics, but it's amazing how much you can do just by sitting down at your computer. So that's one thing that's changed tremendously. The other, on the B2B side, I would say it went through a little bit of a hiccup of during the pandemic. You shifted everything from what you would normally do in B2B marketing to digital. So you would do, you stopped going to events, obviously, or you did whatever events you could, but they were all webinars. It was all digital. But I think B2B had a complex set of activities you could do, and people were meeting in person to close deals. The pandemic eliminated the in-person part of closing deals. And I think that's continuing, although now people are starting to get back out there. I still think you can close a lot of deals without meeting people. But the economic shift that happened for startups was that if you weren't already known and already created demand, it's gotten much harder, especially in 2023 when people's budgets were cut, to just put stuff out on Google and assume that people are looking for you.
Yeah.
And so so on the B2B side, the Google instrumentation doesn't work as well because you don't know what you have to know what people are looking for to know whether the search term is working. And people without budgets are not sitting around all day on Google saying, I need the next best thing to do this thing I never thought of before. So for us, the idea that you have to create a market, I think, and you actually have to actively sell a product. So they sort of lost that art for a few years because of the good times of 2018, 2019, and then the pandemic. It made everything seem like, people have demand for everything. And then when the economy turned, people were like, oh, you may have to cold call people and figure out if they want this thing they'd never heard of before and do that elegantly. And we can't just have a BDR do that for us. So things have changed on the B2B side. Now, where marketing goes down going forward, obviously, this wouldn't be a conversation in 2023, especially this time of year, without talking about AI.
Yeah.
I saw this great quote the other day that AI is like high school sex. Everybody's talking about it. Not that many people are really doing it. Everybody thinks everybody else is doing it, and nobody's good at it. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. Are you recovering? It's so true, though, because everybody's talking about it. So I think AI is going to have some massive impact on marketing, but not nearly to the extent. Like, we're not getting people pregnant and having babies yet. We're just talking about it and we're just playing around with it. So, maybe we're getting to second base once in a while with AI, but we're definitely not getting home runs.
This is the greatest quote that I've had so far. I'm just telling you right now.
I can't take credit for it. Somebody on Twitter or X, or maybe it was a thread, I have no idea. But somebody posted it and I got the repost of it. It was just a perfect way of saying it.
No, it is so freaking accurate. And it's such an apt way of describing the ecosystem around it right now. It's fun. I was on a call earlier this week with one of my other advisors, Greg Hoffman, shout out, right? CMO, Nike. And he's retired. He's doing a book tour. He's doing the thing. And he's I love Greg, for one, his talent and his perspective, but personally, I love him because he was a designer first. And because I was a designer, I just have this soft spot, right? Because I did STEM and I'm good with numbers and all that, but I was a designer.
Yep.
And I have this appreciation for what I see as the value of great design, which is taking complex ideas and simplifying them. Mm-hmm. Right. And Greg brings that to the CMO side and the emotion side and everything. And he and I, when we were talking earlier this week, he brought up, really a conversation about the appreciation that certain cultures have for design. Like, he was in Italy doing a thing, and he's just like, oh, they just live and breathe design. So you just have this passion around it, which is great to have that reception. But then it was also about, I asked him a question about how he permeates the market of thought leadership these days, when everybody's a thought leader. Yep. Everybody has some sort of expert opinion, a lot of castles built on sand, frankly. And AI has been that to me, right? Because we started, like, this whole adventure with Everyday started in the machine learning and computer vision space. And I'm not that scientist. I had to educate myself very quickly, but I got to work with so many great people, right, that are in this space, and the engineers that we partnered with and still on our table who have helped us with our models shout out to Anders Perron, who's now leading the AI team at Boeing, right? And he's the one who helped educate me. Again, build that pie piece, right, of people smarter than you to do it. And he had the most magical explanation to me. And he's like, listen, there's all this stuff going on, this magic hand wave. He's like, this is just, basically human decisions happening rapidly at scale. It's a good it's the best template library you've ever seen, right? So fast forward, and you have the Chicken Littles and the groundhogs and all the other prognosticators of the world speaking of the sky falling and the shadow predicting winter and so on and so forth. And it's so frustrating because it's like, it's every major conflict that happens, everybody suddenly is a regional expert, right?
I've actually, for the first time in a long time, I've stayed out of it because I don't want to be perceived as an expert because I have no idea if it makes any sense or not.
Yeah.
And most of what I've seen has been fun or interesting, but not necessarily useful.
Well,
I haven't gotten deep into some of the paid platforms, and maybe that's where some of the utility really comes in. And I heard somebody say that they're spending, they've created a whole team of people, but when you dig into it, and it costs them almost nothing, right? The software doesn't cost anything relative to the people. And he said the cost savings are going to be amazing. He's the CMO of a big healthcare company. And I said, so I asked him, like, so where are you doing this? He's like, well, we put 15 people in a room in India, and that's where they're experimenting. I'm like, so this isn't really impacting your organization yet. You just see a lot of potential. But, there are people who are using it for writing, which is great. And, it's just like a faster, like anybody who uses the productivity tools should have AI at their fingertips because it's completing sentences for you and all that. But I think the idea that, but to go 2 to 5 years out, I think there are going to be some fundamental shifts, just like, remember black and white days of the internet, and I saw the future there. Mobile, same thing. Like mobile was a platform shift to the point where I can do more work on my mobile than I can on my computer most days because it's faster. And I talking about like writing documents on my phone instead of on my computer. AI is such a fundamental shift that obviously we don't know where it's going to land, but I do think it's going to create new behaviors for marketers that they never thought they could be able to do. And I'll give you an example. I worked for a company during the pandemic. I worked with this company that did creative versioning, kind of like DCO. You know what DCO is? Mm-hmm. Creative optimization.
Okay.
Where you can basically take one ad and create 17 variations of it.
Yeah.
And it worked. It had a little bit of AI in it. It was sort of interesting, and it would do tests and run the tests. And the company got bought, and it's a very successful smallish company. They're doing pretty well. But when you can do that just by going and, like, ideally you would go into a banner creation, like let's say you go into Canva and you say, you create a version and you create a set of assets. And Adobe does this, but I think they do it in an archaic and expensive way. This is relatively straightforward. You should be able to just type in, I need 17 versions for 14 countries. Go.
Yeah.
And you get it in 5 minutes. That's the difference, is that it's so quick. And then you have to scan it and make sure it did it right and all that stuff. But that's fine. Editing is easier than initial creation. And then boom, you just created marketing for 14 different markets. And then you say to it, I need it in these 3 sizes, which are already preloaded templates, and it's done. And then you say, great, now run them and tell me how they do, and A/B test them, or in this case, maybe ABCD test them. And then Google already does this with their optimized, what they used to do with their optimized product. But you could do that without having to deal with all, kind of like what Everyday is doing, to tie it back, without having to deal with all the platform complexity. You can just say, do this, upload it, and I'm done. And then I think in 3 or 4 years, you'll be able to say to your computer, this is what I need, do it, and tell me tell me when you're done. I'll review it, and then you're going to go launch the campaign.
I think that's accurate, because I think my big issue with the AI hype train is comprehension, always comprehension, right? Which is like, that's fine that it will replace these things. I relate it. This is a very obscure representation, but if you're familiar with globalization and economics, particularly with like the elimination of stevedores, in the globalization, like one of the most fundamental innovations was one of the most rudimentary for globalization, and that was the invention of the container, right? The shipping container. Because what that meant was you didn't have all the stevedores, right? The people that loaded and offloaded everything off trains and ships. You just put it in a container, and where it was in the factory in, one country, one continent, would be the same exact thing that it would be in another continent in another city.
We learned from when the railroads had different gauges.
That's exactly right. You worked in railroads, but
so apply that to marketing and think about so the level of creativity that you were just talking about is one thing, but the execution of all that creative to make it productive is a whole nother thing. I mean, so in part of my research, the report that I was mentioning earlier, we were talking about AI in the context of a few different things. And one of the things I said is, who do you think's at risk with AI? And almost every one of them said the agencies. And not because the agencies aren't going to create, the creative agency thing is still very valuable, but it's all the FTEs that get paid to do all the manipulation of the creative that are going to basically be redundant. So creativity is going to matter more, but the execution of creative is going to matter less in terms of.
I was musing on the exact same thing just this morning over coffee early, right? And a little bit yesterday, and I have a little, writing that I do on the side about this, and it's, there's this grand claim of creativity. The what?
So you're an expert also.
Yeah, exactly right. I just like to ponder, but I mean, at the end of the day, though, I think you're exactly correct, and it's back to your idea that comprehension will be there. Just the same as true creativity is not about your ability to execute. I trained in fine arts when I was younger. I can draw really well.
Yeah.
And I would always come to these frustrating points when I would see people that were really talented at drawing. They could replicate a image, photorealistically with a pencil, but they would draw a rooster or or they would recreate something or
they were mechanical, but they weren't creative.
That's exactly it. And then and then there's people that overdraw the creative side, oh, I'm creative. Well, what do you actually do? And they can't nail it down because they're more curators of other people's creativity. And so when you actually, I think it will be a great refiner of what is that creative aspect and how you bring that to this world. And it's well, what AI should do and what I believe it does, and I think Mark Andreessen said this correctly, right? Predicted in his manifesto that it's going to be symbiotic. And what you're going to see is the stevedores were eliminated. It's not going to be, hey, coal miners are going to suddenly learn how to code or whatever that cheesy thing is. It's going to be more hey, the people that got into this industry that end up being a cog and they end up just replicating other people's work, they're going to be out of a job. Now, will it provide them more chance to thrive as great creatives that they might have been able to do? Maybe, because they're going to have all these tools at their disposal that can help them proliferate and generate their big ideas, right? And again, to the evolution of the world is you're just going to see more of the lines blend. When we used to silo, there are software engineers and there's creative designers. Well, now we're in a world where them living together is so magical. I'm doing an exercise, not because anybody's not talented, but because I have a design brain. I'm going to Mid-Journey and I'm entering in images of our interface spaces, and I'm just putting it through a bunch of detailed prompts of hey, what would Dieter Rams have done? What would Saul Bass have done? And a Saul Bass design interface is chaos and it's not useful. Did he do great posters? But regardless, it's this easy way to generate a prompt and to visualize this, but I have to have the comprehension and knowledge in the first place to understand what I'm prompting.
Right. And the prompt engineer thing, I think, is fascinating because it is important. That the challenge I've had is, doing the prompts and, just not maybe the way my brain is wired, but I have to do a lot of prompting before I get even close to what I think I'm looking for. It's probably going to get easier, but being good at telling somebody what you're trying to do is harder than just doing it sometimes.
Truly. But this is where I think
the thing about creatives, I mean, any artist, I listen to this talk art podcast a lot, so you get into the mind of the artist. Sometimes the artists don't really know what they're thinking. They just create, and you can't prompt an AI to just create.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. It's got to be something that means something to them. And so I was just listening to one the other day, and the guy was talking about the experience he had was the thing that he wanted to remember. And so within 3 days of this experience he had, he painted the painting.
Yep.
You can't prompt that, right? Even if you have a photograph, you can't really prompt it. It has to be expressed through his point, the way he saw it. Just a really interesting way to think about art versus advertising, I guess.
Well, no, but listen, I mean, advertising has parts of this, right? Because a lot of, like, I want to connect three kind of dots here, because there's one concept in AI and the art line of thinking that you just talked about, and that's hallucination, right? And this is like, you can't trust.
Hallucinations are fun, right?
Well, yeah, no, we can. Hey, we'll get into that when I'm out in Atlanta. But really, like, you have the trust, which is a very real factor for what's happening in control mechanisms within AI, right? Especially in the deep tech side. And if it's and the production, right, and generative side as well, is if it hallucinates, you don't know when, because it asserts it, and we trust it because of its assertion, right? Because of the way that it speaks. This is the mechanism that makes it so magical, is because we perceive it to be correct, because it uses a level of assertion that looks natural to us, but it will hallucinate.
Phrase, seldom, always. Never, always wrong, never in doubt.
Yes, it's a great one. You have good phrases. You got to put these out.
Yeah. Again, I haven't created any of these, but that always wrong, never in doubt is basically you have more confidence than you do knowledge. And so you say things very confidently and people just believe you. I mean, look at Adam Newman, WeWork. That's a perfect example.
Yeah. Well, look at the toxicity of a lot of investment culture, where they want the Adam Newmans of the world to come in without any doubt and tell them how they're going to change the world. And if somebody comes in and say, yeah, it's like, I'm not necessarily correct, I want to test this, but I think it's a good idea. Like, I've fallen into that trap, because I was taught very early, luckily, great dad and also great education, and it was taught to critically think. And part of critically thinking is always looking at yourself from the outside perspective and saying, hey, I could be very wrong. Why don't I try to argue this from the other perspective and see where I'm wrong? But if you bring that doubt into a conversation, but back to the point, creativity and that flow of creativity that you were talking about is also hallucination, right? Fundamentally, you are taking this abstract concept that exists in your brain and just kind of sketching it out over days. You can't prompt that. I mean, there are copywriters that can help bring that to life. And that particular kind of creativity is great, but prompting it is a totally different skill set, right? And that's where, when you look at the future, and I think to the advertising business, and this is where advertising and marketing and how we're marketing products, I put this past some of the great people we have on our board, right? And we have on our team in the marketing space as well. And I said, hey, if I did a bunch of market research of all the companies and the competitors that were doing X, what would you and the greatest people in marketing and advertising tell me to do? And without a hesitance, every one of them said the opposite. Right? And no, but it's true, because it was like, listen, if everybody's going down this path, the only way you're going to stand out is to do.
You have to go the other way. Yeah.
You have to. And that is where the hallucination and the difference is. Like, you can A/B test something to Wazoo. By the way, I have to connect you with Natalie Padilla, who I talked to on my last one of these.
Okay.
And I'll send you the link. I just posted it to it. But she is so brilliant. She's worked in agency and brand world, but she's on the data side as well. And one of the few people that I think really straddles that world exceptionally well. And she and I were talking about this exact subject of how A/B testing and that particular way of research and data is great for refinement. Yeah. It's great for sharpening the point of.
You still need an idea to begin with.
But you need the idea, and true creativity, true innovation has to be that level of hallucination. It has to be that outside. And I think that, one of the things, David, that I think I naturally just loved when I talked to you is, like, you come from the strategy consulting world, which can be, what it can be. And
no comment,
right? But we know what it can be, and it can be a lot of whatever. It can't be. It's not always the greatest thing, but what it does
It's a
do.
lot of, as the old adage goes, taking somebody's watch and telling them what time it is.
That's exactly. But I will say where the value is that it does provide value, and that's a lot of
Yeah.
the time. But
Well, it helps. It helps. It's basically outsourced critical thinking for people who can't get out of their own way.
yes, and it is the value always of third party perspective.
That's right.
Right? It is, and well, and
My
third party
career
perspectives.
on taking people's watches.
Yeah, exactly. But listen, sometimes that's what you pay people for. Is like sometimes you know the advice, but hearing it from a third party reinforces the confidence.
And to be fair, now I operate, so I actually know exactly what that feels like.
Yeah,
Well,
dude.
but it's interesting being an operator because I definitely sometimes have to sit outside of my own day to day and say, is this what we actually need? So one thing that I've always brought to the table as a marketer is that I always think about it in the customer's perspective, because I don't believe that I have any of the right answers. I think the customer has the right answer because they're the one paying. And if you don't, so one of the things that a lot of people do is they just say, here's what we sell, let's sell more of it.
Yeah,
And my question is, well, what would the customer say about that? And if you're not, whether it's consumer or business, if you're not talking about the customer and the customer doesn't see themselves in that marketing message, they're not going to buy from you. And then you're just selling, then you're just hitting people over the head repeatedly. So
yeah,
it is important to think about that, going the other way. Usually, if you look at the companies that have done that, typically the way they've marketed has been very much a consumer or customer centered view of the world that they live in, not a view of not the view that they have internally. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to win the long-term game, but it does mean that they're going to stand out. So like the thing that popped into my mind was Lyft versus Uber in the early days.
mm,
Right? Uber had a service that was more geared towards people who were used to taking black sedans everywhere. And Lyft just decided that, there's also a need to just be friendly in a car. You're getting into the car, make it friendly. So they put the big lips on the front or the mustache or whatever.
yeah,
And they made it a friendly service. Now, clearly they are much smaller. I think they're like 20, they're much smaller than Uber.
yeah.
Their business practices may have been a little saner than Uber's at the time. But like I still prefer them to Uber because I created my brand preference around the fact that I felt more comfortable getting into their cars than I did Uber's.
It's so
Same driver. I mean, at this point,
yeah.
it's the same driver. It doesn't really matter, but I
Yeah.
still will go to the Lyft app before I go to the Uber app.
The first time, I mean, this has nothing to do with preference on either, but I think to the idea of brand positioning, which, by the way, I want to talk to you about ours because we're going through this very concrete us versus them and wonderful positioning exercise. But with Uber, the first time I ever took Uber, I was in San Francisco by total accident because I'm an idiot. And I shout out to the Oregon Ducks, college football, only sport I've ever really followed, and I'm a huge Duck fan. I didn't even go there. I went to school in New York, but we didn't have a football team. But my parents went there, and I'm from Oregon, right? And anyways, Oregon had Marcus Mariota as a quarterback, and was like number 1 in the country, number 2 in the country. And we're playing Stanford when they were like number 3, and there was a game on, and I bought 50-yard line, second row back tickets. And I was so stoked, and I thought it was in Eugene. And then I brought it up to my buddy, and he's like, dude, it's in San Francisco. It's in Palo Alto or Santa Clara or whatever. And I was like, oh no. And so I took the ultimate early San Francisco trip, which was I bought, a same day flight or a day before flight down to the Bay. I stayed in my first Airbnb where I was actually in a spare room or like couch in somebody's apartment in the Mission. And then I went to the game on the Caltrain, and it was so awful, right? The transportation there was so awful that I downloaded Uber and called an Uber for the first time. And it was a black town car that came up.
Yeah, that was their business. Yeah.
And that was their business. And I remember this town car pulls up to where everybody got off the Caltrain and was like, Jake, and like searching for me because it was early days. And I'm like, yep. And everybody looked at me like I was this VIP getting into this. Yeah. And I was like, oh, that's kind of nice. And then I go back to the couch I'm crashing on somebody, and go get a drink in town. But you're right, man. Like I think the difference in how you position is can be relatively subjective so long as you take the customer's perspective first.
Right.
And I find that particularly valuable, having come from the agency world where I'd kind of always take that perspective and be like, hey, you're just going through that make my logo bigger exercise.
Right.
But people don't like your product like
or
that.
they're just enamored with their own product and they just want to like tell people the world about what they built. And that's just
Yes.
the way customers buy.
No, not at all. And so for what we're going through right now is a very clear, like we're trying to establish a very clear us versus them, right? And it starts with our core product and our core customer, because I'm building this product for what I experienced and my friends experienced and my clients experienced. But we also like are at this point where we're trying to figure out very much in our voice, like who is them? And there's all this divisiveness, and like one part of me wants to be irreverent and kind of, that famous image of Tupac out the window throwing his fingers up, at the world and just say, hey, we don't like you, Microsoft, Google, etc.
Right.
Because you guys are more concerned about taking my data and cannibalizing my business than you are about me actually producing great ideas.
Right.
And the other part of me wants to say, we live in a world that's entirely polarized and constantly us versus them. What I really want is a company focused on commonalities versus differences. And I think us being the central visual workspace for collaboration and for teams, it lends itself to that of like, and what we're going through the exercise, I don't have the answer yet, is, we want to be a company where it's harnessing integrators or this role of people. We haven't come up with a complete personification for them, but it's like, in the old I'm an Apple, I'm a PC commercial is like what we want is
you're more like knitting together all the collaborators, right?
Yeah. And that's what we want is like, who are in the vast history of the human race, who are the people that brought people together and superseded differences, where everybody just wanted to talk about how different we are and how odd it is like one of the reasons I love Atlanta is somebody was asking me the other day.
It's way more diverse.
It's way more diverse, but and with that, right? And with that, at the same time, somebody was asking me Portland versus Atlanta. And listen, I'm from Portland. I love Portland. I think it needs just a hug right now. But I just had this prescient moment where I was like, you know what? Everybody that I talk to in Portland seems very much like they're trying to highlight the differences that they have with everybody else. Yeah. And everybody that I've met in Atlanta, all the like everybody from the tech circle, funding circles, random entrepreneurs, random friends, they're trying to figure out what they can do together and build it.
Interesting.
And I love that because I want to, I want to go back to
the world leaders. Mandela certainly did that.
Yeah.
You could argue that Obama in some ways did that. Maybe Clinton did it a little better. Who else did that? Sadly, there's not a lot of people that do that. You could look at some sports fans that have certainly done that. Navratilova has done that. Maybe even, I don't know if you would say Messi did that. Maybe Ronaldo better. Tom Brady certainly brings people out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
Think about people like that are, well, actually Tom Brady wouldn't be a good example there.
I omitted him from my handwritten list.
Yeah. But, just think about people who cut across so many different lines that they're music people bring people together. Look at Taylor Swift. I mean, the reason why we have one pop star, I won't get into the Beyonce versus Taylor Swift conversation, but I think Beyonce definitely has a different market. But Taylor Swift cuts across country, pop, older, younger, very young. She writes, nobody thinks of her as being, she is pop, but nobody thinks of her as being focused on any one community. She brings people together. I mean, that's why her concerts have been just such remarkable sellouts. Yeah.
I was thinking, speaking of, they're a hot topic these days, but Dolly Parton was one of those.
Yeah, I wouldn't say she brought together everybody though. She does cut across and she's very popular, but I would say Taylor Swift has done a better job of being, Dolly Parton is just Dolly Parton and people love her for that. Taylor
Yeah.
Swift is actually a little bit, she's a little bit broken. Like most of her songs are about how she fucked up every relationship she's been in. And that's actually part of like the reason why, not that I'm a huge Swiftie, but I don't think be on this planet and not appreciate some of her songs. The reason why Anti-Hero is such a big song is because she's basically saying, I'm an idiot. It's I'm the problem, it's me is one of the greatest musical lines ever.
Yeah. That's
Nobody would
great.
ever say I'm the one who was at fault here. And she just puts it out there, but it's also a decent song. So if you think about people who bring people together, she'd be worthy of putting on that list because she has definitely stitched together. She's one of the reasons why people are starting to listen to Dolly Parton again, because they're listening to people who come from country music.
Yeah. No, and that's where it's so funny. I think musicians are going to be a big source of that.
Yeah.
I think musicians are going to be a big source of that. Speaking of Atlanta, I always go to Outkast because I think Outkast was one of the great groups, and they have just experimented. I don't know if you saw Andre 3000's like wild flute album that he just came out with.
Oh no, not the new one though.
Oh, it has no bars. It's absolutely like, and it's funny like when you have somebody that strong in an ecosystem that's willing to just go off the rails, as you have people like you see them struggling to fit it into their preconceived notions.
Yeah.
And that's what's wonderful, right? Because they just keep pushing it and people don't know what to do because they have a pre-established narrative that they want. And and that's very hard for them to adjust to. But I just noticed it's 2:15.
Yeah.
I got an hour and 15 minutes out of you. David, as always, thank you. This has been phenomenal. I
really enjoyed this. You pulled all the good thoughts out of my aging brain.
I don't know about that, man. I'm sure there's a lot more, especially the high school sex reference, which is going down in history as the greatest quote so far. Let's hope we get to do this again and you'll have another good one.
For sure.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much. Enjoy. I hope the new role goes well, and I'll talk to you very soon. I'll send you some updates, but I appreciate it, man. And just let me know if I can help in any way. Okay.
Will do. All right, and same here.
All right, David.
All right, take care, Dave.
Bye.
Bye.